We've all seen it. The evidence is overwhelming. The lies are exposed. And the plea deal is sitting right there on the table.
Name and date of birth.
Laura Owens.
Thank you. And you can be seated, Ms. Owens, if you like, if that's more comfortable for you.
For most people, it's a lifetime. But for a specific kind of high conflict personality, like we're seeing in the Laura Owens case, a plea deal isn't a solution. It's a death sentence. In clinical terms, we call this the plea paradox. Today, we're opening a clinical file on the victim mask to explain the why. And for some people, the truth isn't just inconvenient. It's psychologically impossible. If you ever wondered why someone would die on the hill of a blatant lie, this analysis is for you. I'm John Cordray, a licensed professional counselor, and this is my anatomy of a personality that cannot say, I did it. This is not a diagnosis. I want to be very clear here, but it's my speculations based on the behaviors that we've been seeing over the years. I've done videos about this case, several of them. Many of you are asking for updates. Many of you are asking, what's the deal with the plea deal? It seems to be delaying all of the different court hearings. All right, I heard you. And that's what this video is about. To the casual observer, a mask is something that you put on to hide. But for a high conflict personality, the victim mask isn't a disguise. It's a life support system. In my years as a therapist, I've seen how this mask becomes the person's primary way of interacting with the world. They don't just play the victim. They become the victim to survive their own internal reality. If they were to take off the mask, they wouldn't just be exposed, they would be destroyed. This is why in cases like Laura Owens, we see such a fierce, almost irrational commitment to the narrative. If she admits, I made this all up, she isn't just admitting to a crime. She's admitting that her entire identity for the last several years has been a fabrication. For a personality built on the external validation and pity, that admission is a form of psychological death. The ego can't survive the void that the truth would leave behind. Therefore, the lie isn't a choice, it's a reflex. This brings us to the most chilling part of this investigation, the ego-syntonic mind. Most of us have an ego-dystonic moments. We do something wrong, we feel that ping of guilt. That guilt tells us that our actions don't align with who we want to be. It's uncomfortable. And it's what drives us to take a plea deal or to apologize. I'm sorry that I said that. I wish I wouldn't have done that. I made a mistake. But for the ego-syntonic mind, the lie and the self are perfectly in sync. There's no guilt or remorse because the person has convinced themselves that their actions are justified, necessary, or even their truth. And that's what's so important here. It's what their truth that they are believing and telling themselves. When you see a defendant looking at the screen in a courtroom displaying digital evidence that proves that they were never where they said they were, or proves that they never were pregnant like they said they were, and then they respond with confusion or anger instead of shame, you aren't seeing a good actor. You're seeing someone who literally can't see the truth. Their brain has filtered out reality to protect the ego. In this clinical file, we aren't just looking at the legal stakes of the prison sentence. Like I said, I've done other videos. There's lots of other footage out there if you want to go look at that. Instead, we're going to look at the existential stakes of a human being who would rather spend years behind bars in a cell of their own making than spend 1 minute living in the truth. We're investigating the moments when the mind decides that a righteous lie is more valuable than a shameful freedom. I want to address a significant new development in this case. Laura Owens has recently claimed that she is on the autism spectrum. As a clinician, when a public figure shares a diagnosis like this, it's our job not to diagnose from afar, but to look at how that diagnosis might or might not reframe the behaviors we've been analyzing. In many of the legal filings and the public interactions that we've seen, there are patterns of intense focus in what some might call atypical social persistence. From a neurodivergent perspective, one could argue that these manifestations were hyper-focused or a struggle with reading social cues or boundaries. However, as an LPC, I have to draw a clinical line between processing and intent. Autism affects how a person experiences the world and communicates, but it does not, by definition, cause the complex, multi-stage fabrications or the coordinated legal maneuvers alleged in these fraud claims. There is a vast difference between struggling with social nuances and the intentional creation of a false identity. In clinical practice, we often look for a differential diagnosis. We have to ask ourselves, are we seeing traits of neurodivergence, or are we seeing a shield? A diagnosis used to explain away behaviors that actually align more closely with the high conflict personality traits. My analysis continues to focus on the impact of these actions. Regardless of the internal processing, the external results, the litigation, the claims of pregnancy, all require a level of executive functioning that goes beyond the typical neurodivergent struggles. We're going to keep an eye on how this claim is used in her defense, but for our analysis, we're going to keep focusing on the clinical markers of accountability and the patterns of behavior that have brought this case to the forefront. You've been probably following this case for many years. It's a very interesting case, and I really am interested in the behaviors here. To understand why a person would choose a prison cell over a confession, we have to look back at the foundation. A personality that can sustain a plea paradox isn't born overnight. It's meticulously constructed, brick by brick by brick, through the years of psychological reinforcement. In the case of high conflict personalities, we're looking at the slow motion architecture of the victim mask. It begins with a discovery. In a healthy developmental environment, a child learns that they are valued for their achievements, their kindness, or simply their presence. But for some, the environment teaches a different, more dangerous lesson, that victimhood is a currency. As a therapist, I look for a moment a child or a young adult realizes that a crisis, whether it's a physical ailment or a social slight or even a perceived injustice, yields a higher return on investment than being okay. If a child feels invisible until they are sick, or if they only receive focused, intense emotional warmth when they are being wronged by a peer, the brain's reward system begins to pivot. This is the seed of factitious behavior. This isn't about illness or the crisis itself. It's about the secondary gain, the attention, the care, and the power that comes from being the person everyone is worried about. And once the seed is planted, it enters what I call the validation loop. This is where early environmental triggers create a permanent blueprint for attention. Imagine a young adult who experiences a minor health scare. In a typical scenario, the scare passes and life returns back to normal. But for the developing high conflict personality, the normal is what they fear the most, because normal is where they feel insignificant. Instead, they find that by slightly exaggerating the symptoms or by prolonging the recovery, the validation stays. Our brain is very adaptive. It begins to reward this fabrication with hints of dopamine. They aren't just lying, they are regulating their own sense of worth through concerns of others. Over time, though, this blueprint becomes very sophisticated. They learn which stories work and which ones don't. They learn that the more unjust or unexplainable the suffering is, the more special they become. They aren't just being a patient or a victim anymore. They're being a warrior for fighting an invisible battle. This sense of specialness is the primary fuel for the mask. As the years progress, we have seen that critical transition. The behavior moves from white lies designed to get out of social obligation to a life-altering fabrications designed to control entire systems. This is the cementing of the identity. By the time the pathology reaches the level of cases like Laura Owens, it has hardened. The mask has officially fused to the face. The individual has spent years successfully manipulating clinical systems, doctors or therapists, legal groups, lawyers, support groups. In this stage, the lying is no longer a conscious choice that they make in a moment. It's more of a default setting of their personality. They spent so long rewriting their own history to fit the victim narrative that the actual history, the truth, has become a foreign language that they no longer speak. This is why when we see them in a courtroom years later, we aren't looking at a mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. We're looking at a personality that has been reinforced by 1,000 successful lies. And when the pathology is this hardened, the legal system's traditional tools, evidence, logic, and the threat of punishment fail. Because the individual has spent a lifetime of winning through the mask, they believe they can win again. The high-profile personality can manipulate doctors into performing unnecessary surgeries. They have manipulated friends into giving thousands of dollars. And they have even manipulated the courts into granting restraining orders based on thin air. To them, the courtroom isn't a place where the truth is discovered. It's just the biggest stage that they've ever played. And they believe that if they play it just right and the victim narrative hard enough, the system will break before they do. They're not fighting the charges. They're fighting to keep the only identity that they have ever known from dissolving. This is the developmental blueprint of the Plea Paradox. A life built on a lie can't survive the omission of a single truth. When a high-conflict personality enters the courtroom, they aren't just a defendant. They are the lead actor in a drama of their own making. To legal teams, it's a battle of evidence. To the therapist, it's a fascinating high-stakes play of a psychological defense mechanisms. In this phase, we look at the specific tells of the plea paradox in action. The behaviors that look like defense are actually symptoms of a crumbling ego. One of the most paradoxical behaviors we see in cases like this is what I call compensatory overreporting. Logic suggests that if you're lying, you want to provide a little information as possible to avoid getting caught, just enough that the evidence looks legit. But the high conflict mind works in the opposite direction. They don't just provide an answer, they provide a mountain of proof. Think about the now famous Dropbox folder of evidence that we see in the Laura Owens case. In a clinical setting, this is a massive red flag. This isn't just someone defending themselves. This is someone who's overcompensating for a deep-seated fear that they're not believed. And they take action, and their behaviors lead to over-reporting. Because their internal reality is a fabrication, they feel that they must bury the doubt under an avalanche of documentation at all cost. They create hundreds of screenshots, forged medical notes, and endless email chains. And if they provide thousands of pages of evidence, they believe the sheer weight of it will prevent anyone from looking too closely at page 50. This is a clinical tell. The more proof a person feels the need to manufacture for a simple truth, the less truth there actually is. They are over-reporting because they are overcompensating for a void of reality. The most striking behavior, however, occurs when that mountain of proof is finally climbed and the lie is completely exposed. When a prosecutor or an examiner presents metadata, the cold digital proof that a pregnancy test was photoshopped or an email was faked, we expect to see shame or even admission. Yeah, I did that. I shouldn't have. Instead, we see narcissistic indignation. In my practice, I define this as righteous fury used to deflect logic. When a high conflict personality is cornered by a fact, they don't just act guilty, they act offended. They turn the tables on the questioner. How dare you question my trauma? How can you be so cruel to a grieving woman? This isn't just a tactic, it's a psychological shield. By shifting focus from the evidence to the examiner's lack of empathy, they successfully derail the logic of the moment. The indignation serves to protect the ego from the narcissistic injury of being wrong. After all, if they can stay angry and offended, they don't have to feel the crushing weight of the truth. This is why you see them get more aggressive and more victimized the more evidence is presented against them. The louder the proof, the louder their outrage. As the trial progresses, we see the most extreme versions of the victim mask. This is where we witness the tactical use of tears, the sudden medical emergencies in the courtroom, and the dramatic fainting spells or brain fog that coincidentally occur right when the cross-examination gets difficult. To the jury or the observer, these behaviors often look like a blatant lack of remorse or poorly acted play. As a therapist, I see something much more desperate. This is the plea paradox in its final form. The refusal to break character even when it's clearly not working. This is a desperate attempt to keep the ego from shattering. If they were to sit there calmly and admit the evidence is correct, the victim identity they've spent a lifetime building would dissolve instantly. Without the mask, who are they really? For many high conflict personalities, the answer really is nothing without it. They would literally rather be wrongfully convicted victim sitting in a prison cell than a confessed fraud walking free. This is why they never break. They aren't just performing for the judge, they are performing for themselves. They must believe their own lie in order to survive each day. In this behavioral breakdown, we see the ultimate psychological standoff. The courtroom demands accountability, and that's what they should do. But the high conflict personality is constitutionally incapable of providing it. Every medical emergency, every tear is a brick in the wall they are building between themselves and the consequences of their actions. When you watch the trial clips, don't just look for the lie. Look for the effort it takes to maintain that lie. Look for the sheer exhaustion of the compensatory over-reporting and the performance of indignation. You're watching a person fight a war against reality, a war that they're destined to lose, but one that they are psychologically unable to surrender. If the victim mask is the symptom, we now have to look at the underlying pathology. In the clinical world, we don't just call this lying. We look at a spectrum of behaviors that range from high conflict personality traits to something much more specific and rare. Factitious disorder imposed on self. To understand the plea paradox, you have to understand that for some individuals, the goal isn't just to win a legal case. It's to inhabit the role of a patient or the victim at any cost. This is where the tragedy of the Laura Owens case meets the clinical reality of the human mind. In factitious disorder, historically known as Munchausen syndrome, the person acts as if they have a physical or mental illness when they are not really sick. But here's the key distinction that most people miss. They aren't necessarily doing it for a clear external reward like money or even insurance. That would be malingering. They're doing it for an internal reward of being the sick person or the victim. When we look at the evidence in the Owens file, the claims of pregnancy, the complicated medical narratives, the alleged crisis, we aren't just seeing a legal defense building. We're seeing a clinical compulsion. For someone with this disorder, the lie is like a drug. Every time a doctor runs a test based on a false symptom, the lawyer files a motion based on a fabricated injury, the individual gets a hit of validation. It's like they feel seen, they feel really important, and they feel in control of a world that likely feels very chaotic to them. Taking a plea deal would mean detoxing from a drug of that attention. It would mean admitting that the crises weren't really real, which would cut off the very source of their psychological survival. We often see this factitious behavior overlapping with cluster B personality disorders, specifically borderline and narcissistic traits. But again here, this is my speculation. It's not a diagnosis of anyone, especially with Laura. We're just looking at history, her behaviors, and the things that she said. This is where a high conflict part of the equation becomes explosive. In a narcissistic structure, the individual has an inflated sense of self-importance and a deep need for excessive attention. But they also have a fragile ego at the same time that really can't handle shame. If you combine factitious compulsion, the need to be a victim, with a narcissistic defense, which is the inability to handle shame, you create this plea paradox. To admit they lied is the face of the ultimate shame. It's being seen as pathetic or fraudulent instead of tragic and heroic, or the victim. To avoid that shame, the mind will literally rewrite reality. They aren't just lying to the judge. They have successfully lied to themselves. It's their false narrative that they turn into their own drama that's true. There's another clinical concept that we see at play here. It's called splitting. This is a defense mechanism where the individual sees people in situations in black and white, or all good or all bad. In the mind of a high conflict personality, they are all good, the innocent victim. And anyone who questioned them, you got it, is all bad. They're the persecutor. This explains why during the cross-examination or in their communications with the other side, they seem so genuinely outraged. They aren't just pretending to be mad. They truly believe you are the evil person for trying to expose their truth. In their world, there's no room for, I made a mistake, but I'm still a good person. There's only, I'm the perfect victim. Since they can't be the monster, they must remain the victim, no matter how much evidence is piled against them. This is the most sobering part of this clinical file. Most people ask, why doesn't she just go to therapy, get help, talk to a professional? But as an LPC, I can tell you that this specific combination of factitious behavior and high conflict traits, it's one of the most difficult to treat in the world. Why? The brain is a master of self-deception in all of us. We all have a narrative that tells ourselves about why we are the good guy in our own stories. So when the evidence of your life contradicts the story you tell yourself, the individual doesn't see their lying as a problem. They see the people catching them as the problem. And that's what I see a lot in my therapy practice. If people come to me and they're honest and they get really real and they struggle and they share remorse, they share shame, these real emotions, then we have something to work with. We can get somewhere. But when clients come to me and say, I don't have a problem, the other people in my life do, so I'm coming to see you because of other people's problems, that is a red flag to me. They use therapy not to heal, but as another stage to perform the victim mask. They'll sit in the therapist's office and spend the entire session compensatory over reporting their trauma. A little bit too much going on there, looking for the therapist to validate their lie. If the therapist challenges them, the therapist becomes all bad, and the individual moves on to the next audience member. I've had this happen in real time in my sessions, and it's very difficult to work on. When you understand these clinical layers, you realize the courtroom is the inevitable conclusion of this pathology. It's the only place left where the mask can be tested. For years, they may have successfully managed the small stages, like their friends, family, and even medical professionals. But the legal system is different. It uses objective evidence, metadata, location tracking, bank records. That doesn't care about the victim mask. The plea paradox is the final stand of the mind that has run out of stages. They will stand in that courtroom staring at the digital proof of their deception, and they will hold on to the mask until the very last second. Not because they think they'll win, but because without the mask, they don't know how to even exist. As we close this clinical file on the plea paradox, we have to move beyond the courtroom. While the legal system will eventually deliver the verdict on Laura Owens' case, the psychological verdict is something you'll likely have to deal with in your own life. It's a masterclass in the most difficult reality of human pathology. The fact that truth is not a universal cure. In our daily lives, we operate on a fundamental assumption that humans are rational actors. At least most of them are. We believe that if we just present enough evidence, if we show the text messages, the bank statements, the metadata, the other person will eventually have a moment of clarity. We think that the truth will set them free. For most people, but for others it won't. But the hard reality of dealing with a high conflict personality is that truth is not a cure for a personality built on its rejection. When someone's entire sense of self is constructed around being a wronged party, your evidence isn't a bridge to a better relationship, it's a direct assault on their survival. As a therapist, I've seen this countless times. You can bring the receipts to a high conflict partner, a parent, or a colleague, and instead of an apology, you get a more elaborate lie. The plea paradox tells us that for these individuals, the narrative is more important than the actual reality. They aren't looking for a resolution, they're looking for a win. And in their world, a win means never having to say, I was wrong. If you find yourself in a cycle where facts are met with fury and evidence is met with even more compensatory over-reporting, you have to stop waiting for the moment of clarity. It's not coming. You can't use logic to argue someone out of a position they didn't use logic to get into in the first place. This is the most important takeaway for you as you're watching this. And as a person navigating your own relationships, we often waste years of our lives trying to honesty our way out of a relationship with a high conflict manipulator. We think that if we can just find the right words or the ultimate proof, they'll finally see what they've done. The lesson of the Laura Owens case is that you have to recognize the plea paradox early. You have to look at the small things. If you're with someone who can't admit that they were wrong about a simple mistake, who can't apologize for a missed appointment without turning it into a drama where they're the victim, take note. Because if they can't admit they're wrong about the small things, they'll never admit they're wrong about the big things. The boundary you must set is not with them, but it's with yourself. You have to stop being the persecutor in their life. You have to stop trying to force an admission of guilt that their ego is literally unable to provide. Your survival depends on your ability to accept the truth of who they are, even when they can't. When you stop looking for their confession, you finally give yourself the freedom to walk away, no matter how hard it is. There comes a point in your life and in your relationships, if it's a high personality and there's high conflict, your freedom comes at a cost. Either you say goodbye or you stay. One is not freedom. If you stay, it's a prison. It's always better to set that boundary early. You need and deserve freedom. The only way to win the high conflict personality is to literally stop playing their game. There is a larger question here that we must face as a society as a whole. We live in an era where my truth is often prioritized over the truth. While validating lived experiences is absolutely vital, the Laura Owens case shows us the dark side of that coin. When we create a culture that rewards the victim mask with immediate attention, validation, and financial gain without requiring accountability, we are essentially incentivizing the plea paradox. We have to ask ourselves, are we becoming a society that's easier to manipulate? If we lose our grip on the objective truth, on the metadata of our own lives, we lose our ability to protect the vulnerable. The victim mask doesn't just hurt the people directly involved, it casts doubt on real victims everywhere. It makes the world more cynical, and it feels less safe. We spent this video analyzing the extreme pathology of the high conflict case, but the human brain, it's a master of self-deception in all of us. We have a narrative that we tell ourselves about why we are the good guy in our own stories. We're the ones that's right and the other people are wrong. So when the evidence of your life contradicts the story you tell yourself, and when you're faced with the ultimate proof of your own biggest mistake, of your own deepest lie, what do? Do you have the strength to say, yeah, I did it, and I was wrong? Or would you, like so many we see in the clinical file, choose to die on that hill? If you like this deep dive, you should watch my next clinical analysis of a very complex psychological case that I think you'll find very intriguing. Go watch it now.